Right.
Well, welcome on this very hot night. Scream if you think you're gonna suffocate. There's water in the back. Right, if anybody feels the need for water, because you can get, exceptionally hot and we don't need that. As people online, welcome, and I hope you're now cool at home. If you think of a question during the talk, do put it on chat and we will ask it in the room. So I've got this introduction for Duncan McGibbon, who's given quite a few talks at BRLSI. He was born in Greenock, Scotland, attended St. Mary's University, Strawberry Hill and King's College, London. He's been a poet for a long time, from the 60s to the 90s, and worked with quite famous poets. And he published in a number of journals in the 70s. He's worked in Geneva and Berne and conducted workshops until he moved to Bath. He toured Australia, read at the Melbourne Festival, and was a prize winner in the Wells Literary Festival. The workshop celebrated his 25th anniversary with an anthology, Divers. And he has been publishing collections, Consolations in December 2010, and his poems have appeared in the Salzburg Review, a short story in Jigsaw, another in Tales from the Time Bank anthology. He's the editor of Manifest, a literary review. He's an oblate monk of Pluscarden Abbey in Scotland. And for BRLSI, he is the Poetry and Poets' Voice co-convenor. So, can we welcome Duncan McGibbon?
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Betty. I'm going to read this because my memory is no longer what it was. Okay, so I'll do my best to make it sound as lively as possible. I've also got to operate this thing too, which means, all right. Anyway, we're asking the question, is Emily Bronte's poetry and Wuthering Heights, is it a meaningful account of romantic love or is it not? A complex question. In 1847, a novel was published almost posthumously. It is not working.
Not going forward.
It's not working at all. You see, I knew this would happen. Right. Is it possible to get what's his name up?
Joe?
Yeah, because it's... Maybe I can get it to work now.
I gave you the clicker. Oh, there he is.
I think it was because you were admitting people that it went haywire.
That. Yeah.
But that should be all right then. Nope. But the man who fixes the television and then leaves. We just see that I can get that. Right. So in 1847, a novel was published almost posthumously by an unknown author in three volumes under a pseudonym and was poorly, if not antagonistically, received. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest novels, not just in English literature, but in the world. The novel was Wuthering Heights by the 29-year-old Emily Bronte. Now, in her 1918 essay on Wuthering Heights, Virginia Woolf discerned that Wuthering Heights is a more difficult book to understand because Emily was a greater poet than the writer of Jane Eyre. Virginia Woolf was a modernist and was probably unaware that all Gothic novelists wrote poetry. They began, of course, with Burke's concept of the sublime, which licensed an immediacy of imagery, which was very important for them. This immediacy allows the Gothic writer and reader to evoke an atavistic view of society in which warring conflicts over the role of women, over political power, over religious belief and the expression of emotion could be dealt with directly. Now, to enable such a style, Emily Bronte tells her story like other Gothic writers, such as Anne Radcliffe, and there was a well-thumbed volume of Anne Radcliffe's novels in the Haworth Library, Charles Maturin, by deriving her narrative from themes or tropes. So if you just see, here's the ultimate test. No, it's not behaving, is it? Never mind. Basically, if you take Burke's concept of the sublime, and that is the profundity of spontaneous emotion, atavism, which is a kind of regressing, going back to a previous situation of taste in which the fantastic and the hideous becomes acceptable. Now, they were all poets, which meant that the Gothic novelists basically traced their novels through the poetry that they'd written. I call that a paradigm. And that's how they produced their syntam, which is the novel. Now, this will go wrong. Yes, it will. Okay. Right. So this is an example of some of the tropes that make up Emily Bronte's narrative. Right? Sometimes these tropes can be drawings. A perfect example, a pair of roosters, a visiting species, is attempting to nest and only fly off when Nellie approaches him. As well as a context for Heathcliff's stillness. This is when Heathcliff is standing outside and waiting for Catherine to die. The birds are outsiders, yet they are seeking to settle in a strange land, as Heathcliff and Cathy were. So if you can think of the drawings, and as well as the poems, these are being organized into the following story. Right, I would love to point this, but I don't think it's going to work. No, it's not. Right. Anyway, if you can see here from this family tree, right? If we follow the story by that. So the story goes as follows. A foundling, Heathcliff, is adopted by the Earnshaws. Here the trope is of exile from a poem. The poem in particular is Honour's Martyr. The dark deeds of my outlawed race will then like virtues shine, and men will pardon their disgrace beside the guilt of mine. He and Catherine Ann Earnshaw develop a passionate bond. This paradisal trope is in the poem, shall earth no more inspire thee? Few hearts to mortals given, on earth so wildly pine, yet few would ask a heaven more like this earth than thine. Catherine chooses to marry Edgar Linton, a wealthy gentleman living at Thrushcross Grange, rather than Heathcliff, who is the adopted son of a yeoman farmer. This is the fidelity trope in remembrance. Sweet love of youth, forgive if I forget thee. While the world's tide is bearing me along, other desires and other hopes beset me. Hopes which obscure but cannot do thee wrong. Heathcliff, enraged by Catherine's rejection and his humiliation at the hands of the Earnshaws and the Lintons, vows revenge and leaves Wuthering Heights. Catherine marries Edgar. Again, this is derived from a trope. Mistrust me, everyone. Let me be false in others' eyes, if faithful in my own. But she longs for the passion and freedom she felt with Heathcliff. Heathcliff returns to Wuthering Heights, wealthy and educated, to ruin the lives of those who wronged him. As the captivity trope relates, my master's voice is low, his aspect bland and kind, but hard as flint, the soul that lurks behind. Catherine gives birth to a daughter. Catherine, usually referred to as Cathy to avoid confusion, but dies shortly after. Lockwood relates the discordant voices of Heathcliff's decline, reads Catherine's diary, then dreams of her, imagining she is trying to get in through a window. This is the mystic trope, as the Night Wind, Emily's poem The Night Wind relates. In summer's mellow midnight, a cloudless moon shone through our open parlour window and rose trees wet with dew. I sat in silent musing, the soft wind waved my hair. It told me heaven was glorious and sleeping earth was fair. I needed not its breathing to bring such thoughts to me, but still it whispered lowly, how dark the woods will be. Heathcliff exploits the debt-ridden Hindley Earnshaw, forcing him to mortgage Wuthering Heights and eventually gaining control of the estate. In Honour's Martyr, Emily writes of revenge. Revenge may stain a righteous sword. It may be just to slay. Heathcliff's marriage to Isabella Linton, Edgar's sister, is a sham, and Isabella flees him in disgust. Cathy, Heathcliff's daughter, and Hareton, Hindley's son, grow up under Heathcliff's tyrannical control. Linton, Heathcliff's sickly son, arrives from London and becomes infatuated with Cathy. Heathcliff, obsessed with Catherine's memory and his desire for revenge, plans to marry his son Linton to Cathy, hoping to gain control of the Grange and the Earnshaw inheritance. Linton dies from illness, leaving Cathy alone at Wuthering Heights. Cathy and Hareton, despite Heathcliff's efforts to keep them apart, develop a bond, recognising their shared love for Catherine Earnshaw. Heathcliff dies, leaving Wuthering Heights to Hareton and Cathy. Hareton and Cathy marry, ending the cycle of revenge and despair, finding a measure of peace and happiness. Rumours circulate that Heathcliff's ghost haunts the moors. The novel concludes with Lockwood visiting the graves of Catherine, Edgar, and Heathcliff, as Emily's poem expressed in the Salvation trope in her poem Faith and Despondency, where we were born, where you and I shall meet our dearest when we die, from suffering and corruption free, restored into the deity. This map shows the imaginary landscape. I think it's easy enough to sort out. The way the story is told is fascinating, as it shows a narrative structure as brilliant as a Bach fugue. Emily Bronte, by the way, was a superb musician, and she actually taught in Brussels. She taught music. The exposition is begun by Lockwood, a surveyor who visits the Heights as a tenant at Thrushcross Grange. His housekeeper, Nellie Dean, then takes over the narrative. So that's Lockwood there. Is that coming? No, never mind. You can see how the outer frame is Lockwood. The inner frame is Nellie, even though we hear more from Nellie. And within Nellie's framework, she recounts her conversations with the other characters who are mentioned in that box. His housekeeper, Nellie Dean, then answers by taking over the story in chapter 4, with 4 occasional pauses for Lockwood's explorative notes. Nellie develops contrasting episodes which augment or reduce the story. 2 from Heathcliff, which contains 2 from Isabella, 1 from Cathy, and as a coda, 1 from the Heights housemaid Zillah in chapter 30. Nellie then resumes, and then Lockwood recapitulates and concludes. Lockwood is the voice of reason, the voice of pragmatism, and Nellie's voice is the voice of faith, the voice of intimacy, and the voice of intuition. Catherine's diary goes back to the year 1777. Nellie begins her story in 1771, then retraces it through the years from 1771 to 1802. Lockwood's conclusion is actually in 1808. The actual span of the present in the novel is just over 2 years. So you have 2 years in which Lockwood and Nellie meet, and then they recount the story going way back to 1770. I want to argue in this talk that the novel exists on 4 levels. That, by the way, is the narrative structure. I'll leave that for a minute. That the novel exists on 4 levels: a factual level, a metaphorical level, a moral level, and a critical level. Emily Bronte herself makes this distinction in her poem, A Philosopher. As I saw a spirit standing, man, where thou dost stand, an hour ago, and round his feet 3 rivers ran, of equal depth and equal flow, a golden stream, and one like blood, and one like sapphire seemed to be. What holds the level together as a spindle is the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff. I want to redefine the relationship between Cathy and Heathcliff. This has been and still is the stumbling block to understanding and interpreting the work. I just want to show you this. Those are the 4 levels at which I want to look at it. In Emily Bronte's poem about it, these are not abstract rivers. You can see the different colours that she would have encountered in the moorland streams. So the colours are important because the first one, for example, is the factual level, which I call the blue level. However, I first of all want to just make a slight digression to talk about the way in which the character of, especially the way in which the characters of Cathy and Heathcliff have been presented. For example, that arbiter elegantiae, Aldous Huxley, in his novel Those Barren Leaves, he has Miss Mary Thiplow, who is incidentally Catherine Mansfield, states, if the Bronte sisters were emotionally normal, then she must be decidedly subnormal. And then in another novel, Mr. Proctor, who is the voice of Huxley himself, in After Many a Summer, intoned, because if you consider them dispassionately, nothing could be more silly and squalid than the themes of Phaedra or Othello or Wuthering Heights. Huxley also dubbed Heathcliff a Satanist, as in an essay on Baudelaire, he rubbishes both the poet and Satan, and therefore by inference he rubbishes Heathcliff. Others who were reviewing the book when it first appeared referred to their relationship as obsessive, as perversity, distempered, disturbed and unnatural. Others again wrote about the questionable mental health of the couple. Some would have their relationship be a madness to which the reader might succumb, and that's quite recently from Anne Tyler. Others deny it is love at all. There's no giving and no love as a healthy, normal person would understand it. And that's from a recent blog by Catherine in Victorian Anachronist. I cannot think of another novel so admired and yet so protested against as Wuthering Heights. Firstly, I want to begin with the sapphire blue factual or literal level. WH is about an isolated community in what Bourdieu would call imagined space. Of the 2 families, one are yeoman farmers, the others are gentlemen farmers, the action of which never leaves the few square miles of its real but imaginary West Yorkshire setting. Wuthering Heights is a tragic Gothic romance. It climaxes on the death of the heroine protagonist and the grim sequence of vengeful cause and effect that ensues. Another social and literal concern that affects the relationship is addiction, which is quite a dominant feature. I'm just putting that back on. Emily Bronte's biography relates addiction in her experience. This was the tragic death of her brother from opium and alcohol. The theme has 2 forms in Victorian literature. Drug and alcohol addiction brings about altered states of consciousness, but they also have causal roles to play in the loss of moral control. The other one is the medicinal use of opium, which is absent in Wuthering Heights, though you find it in horror stories such as The Moonstone and Gothic novels such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The theme of addiction appears to form the background, the inciting action, and the literal hermeneutic of the novel. But the regime of addiction is really only incidental, as medicines were more traditional in Wuthering Heights. In other words, here in an isolated community in West Yorkshire, the input from doctors was very limited, as distinct from the Gothic novels of the town, where, of course, people were just taking opium as part of their rather more sophisticated medicinal input. But Lockwood says, "But alas, how could I offend a man who was charitable enough to sit at my bedside a good hour and talk on some other subject than pills and draughts, blisters and leeches?" West Yorkshire was a medically neglected area at the time. The realist theme of addiction is relevant here, as only one of the male and female protagonists has a somatic or bodily dependence. Alcohol flowed locally. The first temperance society was begun in Bradford, which is West Yorkshire. In a rare social comment, Bronte points out through Lockwood, "Such an individual seated in his armchair, his mug of ale frothing on the round table before him, is to be seen in any circuit 5 or 6 miles among these hills." Although encouraged by Heathcliff, Hindley gambles and drinks himself to destruction on his own prompting after the death of his wife. There were some persons sitting at cards. Heathcliff joined them. Another addiction, this time to tobacco, is Joseph the Dissenter, who quotes from the Bible almost as a caricature throughout the narrative. His religion is seen as a deep dissatisfaction, an undertone of peevish displeasure, stuffing a 3-inch pipe full of tobacco. Goodlet is among those who argue that the passion between Heathcliff and Cathy is an addiction. Wisely putting aside metaphysical or psychoanalytic theories of passion, she follows Stanton Peele's definition. An addiction exists when a person's attachment to a sensation or an object or another person is such as to lessen his apprehension of and his ability to deal with other things in his environment or in himself, so that he becomes increasingly dependent on that experience as his only source of gratification. According to her, Cathy and Heathcliff have an addictive relationship, as such couples have. She then analyses them rather along the lines of a social worker's report. Cathy has a need for security. She has lost her mother and loses her father at an early age. Her brother goes to public school, leaving her to contrastingly wise and bitter servants. And Heathcliff, undoubtedly insecure, as the orphan Heathcliff is, they form an innocent yet antisocial relationship. Heathcliff's demotion to a servant expresses the hegemony of the 19th century English class system on that innocence. Cathy resists, but is attracted by the security offered by a marriage to the local gentleman, farmer's son Edgar, who lives there in Thrushcross. Heathcliff disappears in fairy tale to the heath, but in realist mode to any of the immoral but lucrative enterprises to be bid for in the empire. He may have made his money out of slavery, on the seas, or looting under orders. Slavery was still legal in the lifetime of Emily Bronte, though she was, funnily enough, she was born at the time of the Mansfield Judgment, and she died almost in the same year as the first legislation against slavery. Bronte gives no indication of how Heathcliff made his money. Cathy's intense friendship for Heathcliff is never in doubt, but her need for security, according to this account, is stronger. Heathcliff's return signals the continuation of his love and Cathy's frustration at Heathcliff's accusation of betrayal. It is at this point that the language of exalted passion, wild and immoral, breaks through the conventions of marriage. Bronte's experience of her brother's addiction has been sublimated into a complex and emotionally charged language. The stress leads to Cathy's death in giving birth to Edgar's legitimate but Heathcliff's guilt child, symbolising the consequence of her betrayal. The evidence seems to show that she chose respectability out of her insecurity and not as a motive to fall in love with Edgar. Goodlet then goes on to cite the early scenes of Heathcliff and Cathy's childhood. Their closeness is evidence of mourning, isolation, and deprivation, all of which are reduced to be clinical signs of addictive love. She goes on to say that such case histories treat one-sided and bizarre relationships. Goodlet claims that a healthy love affair demands well-balanced and mature individuals who want the best for each other. This is not uncommon amongst well-balanced lovers, but the critical text is Cathy's declaration, "Nellie, I am Heathcliff." Simone de Beauvoir claims it is the tragic desire of all women in love, which I think is rather a typical existentialist generalization. But in realist terms, there's nothing unreal in Cathy's friendship and Heathcliff's love, even in respect of the conventions of their time. Left to themselves, nothing in Bronte implies their implicit immaturity. It is their society and its addiction to power and wealth that poses a threat. It is on this addiction that Heathcliff wreaks his revenge, symbolised by Hindley's fall from grace and Edgar and Linton's invalidism. In a broader perspective, addiction permeates the social mores of Wuthering Heights. Gambling is a causal feature in many 19th century novels, as in fact in many 19th century novels there are misogynic, racist, sexual and oppressive personas, and also oppressive religious personas. But the popular Victorian novel presents these in some way or another as faults of character or addiction. In Wuthering Heights, altered states of consciousness seem to account for the hyperpersonal rhetoric of infatuation that features in the emotional heightened dialogue. From a realist point of view, Emily Bronte describes the landscape of West Yorkshire in a way no other writer has ever evoked it. And even now, everybody simply walks in the footsteps of Emily Bronte whenever they go near those moors. She describes great details. For example, dogs are loyal. A dog recognises Heathcliff as he returns to the dying Catherine. Ellen tells Heathcliff to be on Catherine's grave like a faithful dog. The old dog, Phoenix, returns to the Heights when young Cathy is missing. She asks Hareton to give him back. Dogs defend property. The dogs give notice of Ellen's arrival at Wuthering Heights. A horse's obedience is compared to a dog. Cathy leaves Linton silently for fear of raising the dogs. Ellen is admitted to Wuthering Heights by Earnshaw like a watchdog. Yet none of these, what I call these blue factual details, give a satisfactory explanation of the Cathy-Heathcliff relationship. Social pressures, natural interactions, addictions, and the economy of farming are only incidents and not the triggers of the action. The remarkable thing about Wuthering Heights is that it is an incredible evocation of a landscape, whilst at the same time not centred on that landscape, but moving on with a much more riveting story. As I said at the start, the plot of Wuthering Heights is polysemic in that it sets out to present a realist romance, and then the golden fairy tale, and then a blood-red moral tale, and then finally a mixed story, which I will come on at the end, of an implicit religious criticism in the Gothic tradition. So to turn to the metaphorical, the golden fairy tale is one in which a being, almost dark as if it was the devil, is brought into a family ostensibly an orphan from Liverpool, but also the product of a conflict on the moor, never fully explained, in which the gifts of a whip and a violin that Mr. Earnshaw was supposed to be bringing the children were lost or destroyed. It is as if a being from the heath had smuggled itself in to bring ruin. Perhaps it is the same demon that the 16th century Earnshaw defended the heights from with the gargoyles and the date. The subsequent rejection, humiliation, flight, and return of the outsider is paralleled in the princess and the peasant theme of the romance. The death of the princess and the narrative of vengeance also has a grim-like quality to it. We know Emily Bronte knew German and probably read Hoffmann. However, Emily Bronte used a more local legend, that of the bar guest. The word bar guest originates from Bear-Ghost, e.g. barrow ghost. This can be found in many versions. Charlotte Bronte refers to one in West Yorkshire folklore called Gytrash in Jane Eyre. I remembered certain of Bessie's tales, wherein figured a North of England spirit called a Gytrash, which in the form of a horse, mule, or large dog haunted solitary ways and sometimes came upon belated travellers, as this horse was now coming upon me. It was very near, but not yet in sight, when in addition to the tramp, I heard a rush from under the hedge, and close by the hazel stems glided a great dog, whose black and white colour made him a distinct object against the trees. This is in chapter 12. This is the first mention of the Yorkshire myth in print. As if this is not evidence enough, in Branwell's journal, he talks about a Gytrash being a spectre, neither at all similar to the ghosts of those who once were alive, nor to fairies and sylvan creatures, nor to demons, but the dark war Gytrash was known by the form of an old, dwarfish, and hideous man. So this is a note that you find in the diaries. Emily Bronte is more subtle in her use of metaphor and symbolism. The image of a dog is implicit at all levels of meaning. Lockwood, making his very first visit to Wuthering Heights, is savaged by hounds in chapter 1. Attempting to caress the canine mother, who had left her nursery and was sneaking wolfishly to the back of my legs, her lip curled up and her white teeth watering for a snatch, my caress provoked a long, guttural snarl. Here, the dogs are symbolic metaphors representing the force of Heathcliff's power. They seek to bar Lockwood's entry later. A bulldog seizes Cathy by the ankle when they spy on the Lintons, a premonition of entrapment. They stop Lockwood from stealing the lantern. Joseph's prayer book is kicked into the dog kennel. They prowl unchanged. A half-bred bulldog called Throttler gives a premonition of Isabella's future treatment. Skulker's progeny, Throttler, but is kicked by Earnshaw. Dogs are treated brutally by men. Heathcliff attempts to hang Isabella's little Spranger. Heathcliff reiterates the hanging of Isabella's dog. Hareton hangs a litter of puppies, and Isabella and Hareton tease a dog. Heathcliff strikes Catherine as if she were a dog with evident injury. Yet women befriend dogs. Throttler acknowledges Isabella. Young Cathy has the demon dogs tamed. Cathy befriends the dog teased by Edgar and Isabella. Hareton offers Cathy a crooked-legged terrier, but she prefers her own, whom she names Charlie and Felix. Dogs are also used as name-calling similes. Hindley refers to the young Heathcliff as a dog. Cathy compares Hareton to a dog. Hindley treats Nell like a dog. And they are mere beasts. Edgar's lack of love is compared to a dog's. Heathcliff's final passion for Catherine is compared to a mad dog's. Emily Bronte also uses the adjective dogged in at least 3 times in different contexts, but all to do with a description of emotion. So you see how the realistic treatment of dogs in the realist element contrasts with the parallel symbolic interpretation. And it's the brilliance of the novel that she quickly moves from one to the other. The brilliant continuum from symbolic metaphor through simile transforms many attributes of a dog from a realist image. Stones and fairies are also common as allusions. Landscape features such as Penistone crags went backwards to think. Bear with me. Such as Penistone crags, are treated metaphorically in Catherine's dream of caves and fairies, but realistically as folklore similes elsewhere. The stones show pathways, enclose the heights, and litter the heathlands as remnants of quarries and furnish lintels, floors, and graves. Fairies are either attributes of feminine beauty or superstition. Joseph leaves food out for them. The fairy cave is a place of fascination, but also alludes to a sub-theme of the Gytrash haunting the heathlands. Similarly, the Black Horse Marsh is both an attribute of a creature, another form of Gytrash, and a place of danger, a metaphor for entrapment and oblivion. The entire landscape is in fact symbolic, with the hayfields, the moor, the marsh, the peat graveyard, the Gimmerton. Gimmer, by the way, it's the name of the village. It's a northern dialogue for a sheep. The fenced heights and the crags of one northeastern side, reached only by tracks in the cornfields. The gated park, the plantations, the walled lodge and the grange, reached by the high road to Gimmerton on the southwest side, separated by a stream which becomes runoffs. Like the Yorkshire summer and winter, Yorkshire is heaven and hell. Nature in all its seasons is depicted with a unique animated insight that even those who found the book difficult admired. Right from the very start, the very first reviews condemned the relationship, but admired the description of Yorkshire. She depicts it with a unique animated insight that even those who found the book difficult admire. Lyrical but accurate descriptions of skies, trees, wildflowers, birds and farm animals, and fair weather link the narratives described by different observers. Yet nature is also dark, animated by sudden violent storms and rainfall, winds, constant snow and thunder that can wrest boughs from the trees. And there's a similar passage in Jane Eyre in which a wind breaks open, pushes two trees together. Cathy and Heathcliff are certainly creatures of nature, yet their relation cannot be explained merely in terms of the unbounded desire and emotion of a folk tale. Despite the hint that Heathcliff is a preternatural being, that is only there to intrigue us and not to explain as a horror story, such as the explanations you get in Dracula or the Moonstone. So on the red level, on the moral level, Wuthering Heights is riddled with good and evil. The remarkable thing about Wuthering Heights is that Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship is highlighted by the fact that all the other characters carry on what you could call isolated but moral lives. It's not as if she's writing a horror story where everybody has abandoned morality. It is very much a moral tale. There is no closure in melodrama or even a retributive vindication. Heathcliff gets what he wants out of vengeance, and it does not satisfy him. The others suffer almost without sense from petty jealousies, social habits, pride, and despair. Yet the novel is a devastatingly moral narrative. Conventional morality highlights the singular passion of Heathcliff and Catherine. Despite the mix of love, passion, revenge, and social ambition, it challenges traditional 18th century respectability. The novel does not highlight the destructive consequences of pursuing desires. Heathcliff's relentless pursuit of revenge, Catherine's pursuit of social status, and the overall lack of forgiveness incidentally create a morally vicious world where characters seem only to be driven by self-interest and destructive emotion. Yet in each of the other characters, their responsibility is indicated. They know the breaches they have made because there is a very tight morality in the community in Wuthering Heights. And of course, Bronte's characters They're not very easily characterized as being good people or bad or evil people, but they deal every day with the challenge of good and evil. Heathcliff, although initially a victim, becomes a cruel and manipulative figure. Catherine, apparently driven by ambition and a desire for social status, makes choices that ultimately lead to her own unhappiness and the suffering of others. So there is always consequence in the novel. The novel explores the destructive nature of spontaneous revenge, with Heathcliff's pursuit of it impacting everyone around him. His desire for vengeance, fueled by past grievances and societal inequalities, leads to a cycle of suffering and emotional turmoil. Yet his is no triumph of the wicked, as you might get in contemporary literature, such as de Maupassant's Bel-Ami or Melmoth the Wanderer. The novel does not detail the destructive power of passionate love. Nowhere is passionate love being regarded as being a cause of the unhappiness. The novel, in the novel, Heathcliff and Catherine do not vie for dominance and control, but they seem impelled by forces. As we've already commented, the novel critiques Victorian society's rigid class structure and the limitations placed on women. All the women in Wuthering Heights are repressed. Old Mrs. Earnshaw, who loses a baby, and of course Heathcliff is her husband's replacement of that lost baby. Hindley's wife Frances, Catherine and Cathy, Isabella and old Mrs. Linton, together with the servants Nellie, Dean and Zillah. They are victims of medical neglect, abuse, deceit, entrapment and overwork. Catherine's decision to marry Edgar might be motivated by social ambition and may reflect the societal pressures on women to prioritize their social status. Yet Cathy's love for Edgar is sincere. She makes that clear in a conversation she has. Yet Cathy's love, it's not Isabella's motive, is not the same as Isabella's motive for loving Heathcliff. That is in complete contrast. The novel shows how the unbridled passion of one man for a woman dragged spiritually lesser being to their destruction. Yet the indissolubility of the marriage bond, based on the freely given love of the couple, was the essence of 18th century Christian morality. The genius of the novel is to show up the hypocrisy concealing this freedom. This is why its moral critique is so devastating. Even sincerity cannot thrive in such a world. Ultimately, Emily Bronte is protesting passionate love in a world that is cynical and exploitative. While the novel presents a bleak picture of human morality, it also hints at the possibility of moral reconciliation. Hareton's growth to moral sensitivity suggests the forgiveness and understanding that can ultimately win happiness. Yet even this devastating insight into the sexual hypocrisy of the age Emily Bronte lived in is not a sufficient explanation of Heathcliff and Cathy's passion. This leads to the final level of the novel, as the Three River trope shows. See if I can find this. Yes. But there, where they joined their triple flood, it tumbled in an inky sea. The spirit sent his dazzling gaze down through that ocean's gloomy night, then kindling all with sudden blaze, the glad deep sparkled wide and bright, white as the sun, far, far more fair than its divided sources were. So if you can think of the river, the blood-red river of moral suffering, the blue river of realism, and the golden river of the fairy tale, for her, all three combine together. What they combine to critique is the Christianity of its times, and the love of God is entailed. The basic problem in Christian theology for the Bronte family, and at the time of churchmen such as Patrick Bronte, was between a manichaeistic and doom-laden account of fallen nature, which was Joseph's religion, and the respectable access to God in Anglicanism. Yet there was a strand of local evangelistic piety of access without God's help, known as Pelagianism. Wesley himself discussing how the gates of hell have not prevailed against the true church, wrote that God always reserved a seed for himself, a few that worshipped him in spirit and truth. Then he affirms that Pelagius too was one of the holiest men of his age, certainly better than Augustine, who was as full of pride, passion, bitterness, censoriousness, and foul mouth to all that contradicted him. I verily believe the real heresy of Pelagius was neither more or less than this, the holding that Christians may, by the grace of God, not without it, that I take to be mere slander, go on to perfection. Pelagius held that people could go straight to God without his help, without God's help. Thus, there was a mild Pelagian strand in Methodism. This strand blended with the Wesleyan missionaries who came to Haworth before the Brontes. Early Methodism had not yet broken away from the Anglican Church. The Brontes themselves were brought up on Methodism, two of the most important religious influences on them. On their father, Patrick Bronte, were Wesleyan Methodism and evangelicalism. Patrick Bronte was a perpetual curate who was introduced to Wesleyan Methodism through Reverend Thomas Tye and later became an examiner at the Woodhouse Grove School, a Methodist institution. There he met his wife, Maria Branwell, who came also from a Methodist family. Her sister, Elizabeth, Aunt Branwell, cared for the Bronte children after their mother's death. The Methodist movement must have had some impact on the religious beliefs and values of the Bronte family. Unlike some forms of Anglicanism, especially in Ireland at that time, there was little Calvinistic predestination among Anglicans of Methodist influence. Wesley held salvation to be open to all who sought it. G.L.T. Harrison said that Emily Bronte found in old Methodist magazines stories of conversion and spiritual conflicts that may have influenced her writing in Wuthering Heights. She had a particular interest in these journals. Emily and Charlotte went to Brussels in 1842 to enroll in the boarding school run by Constantin Heger and his wife. Their time at the boarding school was cut short when Elizabeth Branwell, their aunt, died in 1842. It's likely they came under the influence of a sect of Catholicism known as Jansenism. Whether Heger was a Jansenist is difficult to research, but Belgium was permeated with it, as its origins were in Leuven with Cornelius Jansen. Heger was a Belgian nationalist who literally manned the barricades in the revolt, and Jansenism was a feature of Belgian nationalism. The sisters commented that Heger's Catholicism was particularly strict, which is also a feature of Jansenism. Having been introduced for the first time, they probably found it very difficult to distinguish between Jansenism and what you might call Orthodox Catholicism. This background allows us to understand the impact of Jansenism through Heger and the impact it had on both Charlotte and Emily. Charlotte had a love affair with Heger, and there are letters which she wrote to him, but I don't want to go into that aspect of the influence. Emily was very distant from Heger, didn't really like him very much, but instead of the staid Anglican and Methodist debates on grace and original sin, here was a belief in salvation that was on a juridical and objective basis. Jansenism asserts that God's role in sending grace cannot be resisted and does not require human assent. It also asserts that there are some commands of God just persons cannot keep, no matter how hard they wish and strive, that it is possible for human beings who lack free will to merit, that it is wrong to say that Christ died for all. And it's interesting that there's very, very few of Emily Bronte's religious poems that actually are addressed or mention Christ. Jansenists believe that God's grace was the sole source of salvation and that human free will was essentially powerless in the fate of divine will. They also believed that grace was not universally available, but was bestowed on a select few, predestined by God because of their initial creation. in a state of innocence. What Emily Bronte is doing is conveying this Jansenist conception that because God created innocent man, God cannot contradict himself by allowing everyone to fall. There had to be exceptions. And of course, what you get is that Emily and Heathcliff are these people impelled by a powerful call that they cannot themselves control, while everybody else in the novel, of course, is struggling. Another much more evident source lies in the play by Jean Racine, which presents a love triangle between Titus, Berenice, and Antiochus. I would like to indicate them, but I think you can work out. Both sisters were given the play to study by Hager. Emily complained to Hager that he wasn't dealing with the subject matter, only using it as a way of training them in grammar. And that's interesting because in the play, Berenice loves Titus. Titus loves Berenice. Berenice feels betrayed by Antiochus, whom she does not love, but he is a lifelong friend whose support she was counting on. Yet because Antiochus loves Berenice, he cannot endure mere friendship. All three depart alone. Racine also has Antiochus introduce his sidekick to the place where Titus and Berenice have their respective rooms. He also has Titus write a letter expressing passionate love and separation. Both of these incidents have their parallels in Wuthering Heights. Emily Bronte reproduces this triangle. Edgar loves Catherine, Catherine loves Edgar, and Heathcliff loves Catherine. But Catherine does not love Heathcliff. On the contrary, even more, she cherishes him as an intense childhood friend. All three are left alone to die separately. Friendship was more important than sexual love for Emily Bronte. Friendship is a spiritual concept in Wuthering Heights. And this is a poem that she wrote. Love is like the wild rose briar, friendship like the holly tree. The holly is dark when the rose briar blooms, but which will bloom most constantly? The wild rose briar is sweet in spring, its summer blossoms scent the air. Yet wait till winter comes again, and who will call the wild briar fair? Then scorn the silly rose wreath now, and deck thee with the holly's sheen, that when December blights thy brow, he still may leave thy garland green. This compulsion, by the way, Racine himself was a Jansenist, was an active Jansenist, and his depiction of this love triangle is precisely people being called by God and who cannot resist it, and yet at the same time cannot relate to each other because they're under a compulsion. This compulsion to give in to passion without compromise is an aspect of Jansenism. Monsieur Heger's curriculum was not the only influence from this creed. Such views were gaining ground during the Enlightenment. In early 18th century England, for example, John Locke's pupil, the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, expressed the belief in his Characteristics of Men, Manners, Opinions and Times of 1711. Shaftesbury held that man is endowed with a natural impulse for virtue, the exercise of which would lead to his and society's happiness. Pelagian ideas can be seen as passing into English fiction soon afterwards, in the 1740s, for Henry Fielding read with admiration the work of these latitudinarian divines, such as Wesley, who followed Pelagius's ideas. It certainly is possible that Emily Bronte read Fielding. Tom Jones is an innocent foundling. The sisters did not like Jane Austen, for whom love is respectable but sexual. It is evident that Catherine's childhood enchantment with Heathcliff challenges orthodox friendship, yet it is not sexual. It is innocence taken to a transcendent level, as can later be found in George Eliot's Silas Marner, Dickens's Old Curiosity Shop, Robert Louis Stevenson to Child Garden of Verses, and later Barry's Peter Pan. Of course, the Victorian focus on innocence had an origin in a Wordsworthy and secret look at paradise, all of which stems from Milton's account of Satan's delight at seeing paradise for the first time. It's a neglected aspect of Milton that the devil encounters the beauty of God's creation before he decides to tempt Adam and Eve. And there's a very, very long description of that, of the beauty of paradise, which is massively influential on subsequent poetry. As such, it was influenced by the view of the same Pelagianism that rejected the doctrine of original sin as part of his wider belief that man was endowed with sufficient grace from birth to lead a perfect life. Heathcliff and Catherine's pastoral paradise, which they share as children, is a representation of the initial innocence of Adam and Eve. Because of their natural initial perfection, they act outside of God. They encounter God as an equal, but without freedom. God is there in front of them, pulling them like a magnet towards love, which cannot be related to any purely human form of love. They encounter God as an equal. They are fated to love. For Emily Bronte, the path of other elected beings is a path of repentant suffering. So this is the way she accounts for all the other people in the novel. She wrote an essay for Hager called Le Papillon, the butterfly. God is the God of justice and mercy. Then assuredly, each pain he inflicts on his creatures, be they human or animal, rational or irrational, each suffering of our unhappy nature is only a seed for that divine harvest, which will be gathered when sin, having spent its last drop of poison, death having thrown its last dart, both will expire on the funeral pyre of a universe in flame and will leave their former victims to an eternal realm of happiness and glory. So she didn't believe the other characters in her novel were doomed and were damned. On the contrary, she was exercising a double morality in which, especially at the conclusion of the novel, people, if they devote themselves, if they work hard, if they put up with their suffering, will achieve happiness. But Heathcliff and Catherine are different, and that's the genius of the novel. Exceptionally, God has to grant the elect salvation because of their original blessedness. Thus, Catherine and Heathcliff lead natural but blameless lives. They are so much under the will of God that the path of moral virtue means nothing to them. They constantly speak of each other, of heaven. For example, at the death of the old Father Earnshaw, Nellie says, "The little souls were comforting each other with better thoughts than I could have hit on. No parson in the world ever pictured heaven so beautifully as they did in their innocent talk, and while I sobbed and listened, I could not help wishing we were all there safe together." Their unity is stronger than earthly love. Cathy sincerely loves Edgar. And this perhaps is a controversial point of view, because it's almost impossible to read a critic who doesn't in some way or another say that Cathy betrayed Heathcliff. But then Cathy never loved. It was more than that, as you get in the Racine play. What, in the end, shocks Berenice is the fact that she will lose the friendship of Antiochus. It's my secret, but if you will not mock me, I'll explain it. I can't do it distinctly, but I'll give you a feeling of how I feel. Nellie is more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. And Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. Heathcliff is called too strongly to God. He does not know what being in love is. Catherine and Heathcliff have no choice. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. Heathcliff is heedless of death. He neither spoke nor loosed his hold for some 5 minutes. I don't know whether, in fact, you've ever tried looking at somebody for 5 minutes. But I don't know whether Emily Bronte got her internal timing wrong, or whether, in fact, she really wants to convey a love so obsessive that Heathcliff is looking at the dying Catherine for 5 whole minutes. So that's something I'm not too sure of. "Oh, Cathy, oh, my life, how can I bear it?" was the first sentence he uttered in a tone that did not seek to disguise his despair. "You and Edgar have broken my heart. Heathcliff, you have killed me and thriven on it." I think Heathcliff had knelt on one knee to embrace her. He attempted to rise, but she seized his hair and kept him down. "I wish I could hold you," she continued bitterly, "till we were both dead. I shouldn't care what you suffered. I care nothing for your sufferings. Why shouldn't you suffer? I do. Will you forget me? Will you be happy when I am in the earth? Will you say so, Heathcliff?" "Don't torture me till I'm as mad as yourself," cried he, wrenching his head free and grinding his teeth. "Are you possessed with a devil?" he pursued savagely, "to talk in that manner to me when you are dying? I shall love mine and yet take him with me. He's in my soul. And," added Catherine musingly, "the thing that irks me most is this shattered prison. After all, I'm tired of being enclosed here. I'm longing to escape into this glorious world." Years later, Nellie talks to Heathcliff after Catherine's death and just before his own death. "Then you're not afraid of death?" I pursued. "Afraid? No," he replied. "I have neither fear nor a presentiment nor a hope of death. I have a single wish, and my whole being and faculties are yearning to attain it. I am swallowed up in the anticipation of its fulfillment." Heathcliff dominates the final chapters of Wuthering Heights. His affirmation is the ultimate statement of Emily Bronte's faith, as summed up in "No coward's soul is mine." For her, the unity between nature and supernature lies in people's natural desire for God. This was something that was just unheard of in the church, both the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and even by Wesley. The idea that, in fact, we could desire God as a natural thing. This seems to be what lies behind. I'm not saying that Emily Bronte was influenced by any particular kind of Jansenism, but the thing that stands out more than anything else is the fact that this uncontrollable desire for unity with God, which they call happiness. In her poem, she misunderstood, right? She reinterprets the idea of the fear of God. "No coward soul is mine," meaning there is a kind of equality there. Only pure friendship is open to the sincere love of God. "Though earth and man were gone, and suns and universe ceased to be, and thou wert left alone, every existence would exist in thee. There is not room for death, nor atom that his might could render void, since thou art being and breath, and what thou art may never be destroyed." Only 3 people have ever expressed this opinion at that time. Now, of course, it's commonplace. The philosopher Leibniz, St. Teresa of Avila, and Emily Bronte. As Leibniz wrote, "As to St. Teresa, you have reason to esteem her works. I found there one day this lovely thought, that the soul must conceive of things as if there were only God and itself in the world. This even yields a considerable reflection in philosophy, which I usefully employed in one of my hypotheses. The friendship of Catherine and Heathcliff tells the reader that loving friendship can be passionate and ecstatic if it is open to God in such a way that both can be mirrored together under his gaze." Thank you. So do you have any questions? It's a very, yes.
I have a comment rather than a question. Right?
Yes.
Can you use the mic or can we hear each other?
We can hear each other, actually. Yeah.
People online need you to talk.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a comment rather than a question. I did Wuthering Heights for O level.
Yes.
a few years ago. I hated it so much.
Yes.
That I chose to separately do after my Jane Austen for a level. And I just wish I could have a teacher like you at school who could open my eyes to what Wuthering Heights was all about. Because at the time, I just thought this was a very confused story, so many relationships from people with similar names, you know. But what you talked about the theatre, I can see there's so much more to it. So thank you. That was all.
No, okay, thank you for that. The GCSE curriculum is dominated by what you could call the social function. It completely leaves out the fairy tale function, and of course, it also leaves out. I mean, it's a moral tale, it's a realist tale. And the problem is that it's not that, and therefore you're quite right to be frustrated by it because it's not what she's trying to say.
No. Thank you for that confirmation.
Right, it's one of the other. Yeah, no. I just was noticing that it was the same time as the American Revolution.
Yes,
But
yes, it was. Now,
no reference. So.
there was no copyright in America at that time. So the minute people began to read Wuthering Heights, it instantly had an American readership, which was as wide and as popular as her English readership. Yes, she probably was an influence on some novelists who weren't necessarily Gothic novelists in the way that she was, but nonetheless, as for the American Revolution, I can't really comment on that because there's no, like so many people they lived in Yorkshire.
But the parallel to, or the dichotomy between friendship and passionate love, you know, I think that it's something that.
Yes, we don't know whether she read. I mean, the key person here is Rousseau. Did she read Rousseau? It's possible that she might have read Rousseau or even Leibniz in the library.
Because you started off by saying that was.
She almost certainly read Burke. It's in the library. There is a list of the library books. So, but Burke set the sublime in motion. So there was no need to go back to Burke. It was already happening in the succession of Gothic novels that were pouring from Lewis, from Walpole, and many others.
Right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's probably time to get cool. And so, can we thank Duncan once more? Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks very much. And again, thank you very much for your patience.